Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 195 of the podcast. I'm excited to have Gerald Fadayomi back on the podcast for this episode, and we talk about navigating adversity and battling anxiety and his new book, When Life Gives You Lemons. So we talk about the book and what's the point of it, where did it come from, and it's all about battling adversity and a mindset and faith, and he has certainly been through lots of things. You'll hear him talk about that. So this is something that he would say he wasn't naturally good at, and I don't know who is, but life and faith have led him to a place where now he has learned to ask some key questions. And so the book talks all about that. We don't hit all of it from the book, but we do hit a good part of it. And the other thing I would encourage you to do, because this is not what we talked about in the interview, but I would absolutely encourage you to check out Gerald's social media from the last few weeks in conversations about racism, injustice, George Floyd, all of that. He is certainly one of the people that I've looked to learn from, to listen to take action on some of the things that he's talked about. And he's been a part, so you can watch an Instagram live of him just talking, but he's also been a part of a number of different conversations in different arenas. And it's all been really, really good. So I would highly encourage you to check that out. He's Gerald Fadayomi on Instagram and Twitter. And we'll include that in the links in the show notes here at nickblevins.com/episode 195. Before we jump in, I want to give a thanks to our podcast sponsor, Serve HQ. They create Huddle Up, a great resource for communicating with your volunteers and teams and with students. And certainly now is a time when communication has been really important, because the face-to-face, the gatherings, they haven't been happening for a long time. And many of your churches are starting to meet in person again, and Huddle Up could be the tool that you transition to, so you're not using a bunch of different things like Facebook groups and MailChimp and Remind and your church management system or Slack or things like that. This is one platform that really brings together all of those same kind of functions, but gives you safety and accountability and security built in. That way, you know that what's happening, what's being communicated there, all of it is safe. I also like, as the user, as the volunteer or the team or whoever it might be that's receiving the communication, they can kind of decide which way they want to get it. Is it through text? Is it through email? Is it in the app with a notification? So that allows them to kind of live on whatever platform they prefer when they receive communication. So it's a great tool. You can check it out at nickblevins.com/huddleup. And we'll go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Gerald Fadayomi about his new book, When Life Gives You Lemons. Well, today we have Gerald Fadayomi back on the podcast with us. Welcome back, Gerald.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Yeah, and I don't feel like it's been that long since you've been on. Maybe it's a year and a half, something like that, but a lot has changed. So for anybody who's not familiar with you, maybe you can introduce yourself, but also for people that are familiar with you, what's going on lately? A lot has changed since we last spoke.
Yeah. So if we haven't met, my name's Gerald. Good to meet you. I would ask you yours, but you can't talk to me back through a podcast, so you just have to settle for knowing me. Man, I'm in Atlanta. I spent 5 years on staff at North Point as a student pastor there. Absolutely loved my time there. Went up to a cabin with some friends and prayed, and God really just rocked my world and basically told me, hey, I want you to shift into a college space and start creating environments for college and young adults, but also create spaces where the next generation can have a more active faith by serving. And so I left staff out of nowhere and started a conference that year for college students at the University of Georgia. Had about 600 college students show up to year one, and got them connected to 17 different local nonprofits as they served there. And then as of recent, I just came on staff at Mountain Lake Church here in Atlanta as a teaching and young adults pastor. And so I'm helping launch a young adult gathering that we're calling Church once a month for college and young professionals. So that's what I'm doing now. Married, have identical twin baby girls who were born in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, which is a super long, crazy story. The short of it is I missed their birth because of coronavirus. My wife went into labor while I was waiting for a coronavirus test result to come back. And because of that, I could not be in the hospital with them. And so super difficult, because of all of the testing that needed to be done for my wife and I, and because of other people who had coronavirus in the hospital, the short version of a long story is we actually spent 4 days with our girls in the first month of their life. And so an extremely difficult season for us, but we're on the other side of it and they're at home and they're doing great. So yeah, a lot has changed. New job, new conference, twin girls, everything's different, but it's all good.
Yeah, that is good. Man, that is hard. Yeah, our firstborn, we had to be in the NICU with him for a week, and then there were parts where I couldn't stay because once you're there long enough, like they only let one parent stay, and obviously it's going to be mom. And you had to go home, come back, but I can't even imagine a month or like you had to deal with on the front end with all that, which is those are some of the impacts of coronavirus that, you know, if you know someone, you hear about it, but sometimes you just don't realize we all know the terrible impacts health-wise, and you and I were talking about somebody I know, you know, that's had it and been through it and things like that, the losses, but then there's things like that too. And seniors graduating this year is another one that, you know, comes to mind of like, there's so many people that you can't, it's not just next year. You can't get that back, you know, just like in your case, but they're home now and you're not getting any sleep probably. And they're amazing. And it sounds like everybody's doing well, which is a great thing.
What is the sleep world word that you speak of? I've never heard of that before.
As long as you can stay awake through this podcast, like I'll hit pause and wake you back up, you know,
I love it.
A little nap. It's cool. Totally understand. As a parent, I get that. My wife was way better at that, by the way, than I was, the no sleep thing. Like I could stay up late. I can stay up all hours, but waking up every 2 and all that, it's rough. I feel for you. So the other thing you have going, I want to ask you about the young adult stuff later. I think that would be something to dig into a little bit more. And even I want to ask you about student ministry in this season of coronavirus. And some churches are starting to gather in person again, but you know, a lot aren't. But before we do that, I want to talk about the new book you have coming out, When Life Gives You Lemons. Tell us about the book and kind of the reason you wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Nick, I'm not an expert on much at all. But if there is one thing that I know in life, it's adversity. And the only reason I know a lot about it is because I've been through a lot of it. So for those of you who don't know me, just some quick backstory. My parents were never married. My dad left in the 3rd grade. My mom was a diagnosed schizophrenic, which led to seasons of homelessness and foster care for me. My mom went to jail my junior year of high school. So 16, I was on my own as an adult. I became a club promoter in the city of Atlanta. I threw parties all over the city. And in 3 years of doing that, I actually had 3 friends who were murdered and 1 friend commit suicide all in the same year. That season led me to faith. It led me to ask questions about what it looked like to follow Jesus. And as I started following Jesus, I ended up becoming a staff member at a church. Never planned to do that. Got hired at North Point as a student pastor, met my wife at North Point as well. And in our first year of marriage, her dad took his own life. Which we did not expect or see coming at all. It's a super difficult season there. And then as of recent, like I mentioned, missing the birth of my identical twin girls. And so a lot of adversity in my life for sure. And honestly, I've handled it really poorly for most of my life. A lot of asking the question why, a lot of wondering why God hadn't stepped in to do anything about it. Most of this before knowing Jesus. And so because I'd handled it so poorly for most of my life, when this season of adversity came with our girls, there were some questions that came to mind that were from a sermon that I'd written a couple of years back. And those questions really changed the way that I responded to the adversity that I was dealing with in the season. And so because of that, I figured, hey, why not write this down and see if it could be helpful to some other people so that we don't find ourselves in this cycle of why, but rather we ask the right questions that will allow us to get the most out of the seasons of adversity that come our way.
Yeah. And I mean, man, there's a lot in there. And so you definitely are writing from an experience and I want to hit at least one of the questions if that's cool with you. But before I do that, maybe I'm throwing a curveball at you. I'd love to know, because I don't know this part about your story, who or what was like a major influence when you did find your way to Jesus and to the church, you know, stepping out of the life that you talked about before and getting connected to the church?
Yeah, there's a bunch of people I could mention. I'll talk specifically about 2. Wes Bender was the director of teen initiatives at the YMCA that I grew up going to. And Wes took an interest in me that he did not have to take. He went far above and beyond his job description to really invest in my life. And Wes was a Christian, and he may have, but I really don't remember any moments where he specifically like shared the gospel with me. He more so lived the gospel with me. And in every hard season, that came my way, he was the constant figure that would show up no matter where I was living or what I was doing. He was always there. And so Wes was a really, really, really big part of my life and helped me see who Jesus was. And then I have two adopted parents, my best friend's parents, who kind of took me in, not legally, but when everything was happening with my mom, that was the place that I'd go for Thanksgiving and Christmas and holidays. And over the years, they've become mom and dad. And my best friend became a brother to me, and he just had a little girl of his own. But they were Christians, and they went to North Point, and they introduced me to the church and would constantly be praying for me and just showing me what grace and truth and love truly looked like. And so those two sets of people were massive influences in my life and still are to this day.
That's awesome. I think most of us can point, to people, and life experience is different and circumstances are different and all those things. But when you think about your journey, there's usually, those names for sure. So in terms of the questions, I don't want to have you give away all the questions of the book or whatever, but what's one in there that maybe you could talk about with us and we could explore a little bit?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, let me just tell you the goals of the book, because I think they help set up the questions a little bit better. So there's two goals for the book. One is that in a season of adversity, we'd actually slow down and ask the right questions. It's very easy to try to respond and to kind of put our head down and get through a hard season and just hope to get to the other side. But what I actually believe is that there's gold in a hard season. There's gold in a season of adversity, and we can pull the gold out of it if we'll slow down and ask the right questions. So the first goal is to ask these three questions. The second goal, though, is to redefine the word good, right? I often think of Romans 8:28 when I think about this idea that the scriptures say, and we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. For most of my life, my definition of good, Nick, has been my purpose, my will, my plan, right? Like if things are going according to my purpose, then everything's all good. The reality is that the scripture doesn't say according to my will, my purpose, or my plan. The scripture says according to his purpose. And so as we look at adversity, we have to pause and ask ourselves, well, what is the purpose of God for each and every one of us? And I think the purpose of God for all of us as ministry leaders, as students, as parents, adults, whoever, as we make the decision to follow Jesus, I think the purpose for us is really simple. It's one, to be transformed into the image of Jesus, to be conformed in the image of the Son. But two, it's to lead people to know Jesus, to make disciples, right? And so if the purpose of our life is to become more like Jesus and to lead people to know Jesus, then we then have to go and look at all of our adversities and go, well, if that allowed me to become more like Jesus, which when we suffer, we become more like Jesus. And if it creates opportunities for me to share the gospel, then even though this situation is hard, painful, even though I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, and I definitely wouldn't want to go through it again, the reality is that season was really good if it leads us to become more like Jesus. And so I want to redefine that for us as we kind of walk into the question. So the first question in the book is simply this: it's what's in my control. And the idea around this is, in seasons of adversity, it feels like everything is out of our control. But the reality is that there's more in our control than we realize, and there's more in our control than we think. And so I want us to slow down for long enough to pause and go, okay, there are things that are concerning me. There are things that are stressing me out, things that are making me anxious about that. I want to release as many concerns as possible to God. But I also want to identify in those things that are concerning me, what are the things that are in my control? And I'm going to work as hard as I can at those things. So I release my concerns to God. I do my best to do the things that are in my control. And what we know from the scripture is doing that actually leads to a life of more peace, right? Like this is what Paul wrote in Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, present your requests to the Lord. And when you do, we get the peace of Christ that passes all understanding and guards our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus our Lord, right? So we know that when we release our concerns, our anxieties, when we do what's in our control, and in that sense, it's prayer and petition, then what we find on the other side is peace. And so that's my hope for all of us, is that we would experience more peace by identifying the things that are in our control.
Yeah, and I guess most people, when you're going through that, we don't think about the things that are in our control, because that's not the things we want to be in our control, right? You want the things that are hurt or messed up or tragic. Like you want to be able to control those things,
right? Not
your attitude, your response, and your devotion to God, the things that you're talking about that do matter so much more. Let me ask you this, because as someone who has pastor students or anybody, I think one of the most common questions you could get in a church context would be, did God make this happen? Is God making all this happen? You know what I mean? Because there's like a, and I'm sure theologically people land in different places, but there's just a tendency, even I know in our church, for people who are new to faith, to have this puppet master view of God. So therefore, when the tragedy happens, clearly he did it. And then there's a theological perspective too, that maybe he did. Some people would adopt that and would, in a sense, teach that
right
for this reason. Now, not everybody lands there. You know what I mean? So, like, how have you talked about that when people come to that? Have you wrestled with it with yourself? I mean, you talked about going through some of that as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely two different theological camps when it comes to that. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't know. Here's what I do know is that God is sovereign and he's in control. What I also know is that if we'll allow him to, he can work all things together for our good and he redeems all things. And so I don't know whether or not God caused the adversity. What I do know is that he could use it. What I do know is that it can become an opportunity for us to be more like Jesus and for us to lead people to know Jesus. I think the other reality that we have to be aware of is to not attribute every bad thing that's ever happened to God, because we have explanation for why bad things happen in the world, right? It's sin. Mm-hmm. It's the brokenness of humanity from the decision made by Adam. And so we know that because Adam introduced sin into the world, there's brokenness in the world. And a lot of the things that we attribute to, well, maybe God is doing this, or maybe this is him punishing us, or maybe this is part of a master plan that he's working together. I don't know, maybe. But there's also a strong likelihood that it's just a result of the fact that we live in a broken, fallen world. And until the second coming of Jesus, we're going to have to deal with the adversity that comes with the world that we live in today.
Now, I have to ask, you also have a digital course that you and somebody else, Hannah Hall, are partnering to make. And I know in that it talks about battling anxiety. I don't know if that's something addressed as much in the book, but tell us about the course and even this anxiety thing, because that is certainly something that I feel like year after year, more and more people are wrestling with and identifying if they didn't even realize, that was something they were dealing with before. I just messaged another children's pastor I know of today who thinks they were wrestling with that just again yesterday. Yeah. And so, I saw that and was thinking, what's the connection here and how much are you talking about that either in the book or the course or both?
Yeah. So the course is actually a result of the book. I was writing a book about battling or navigating seasons of adversity. And the more that I wrote the book, the more that I realized how closely related the adversity of our life is to the anxiety that we feel. And I started going down the road of trying to write things about anxiety. And anytime that I would, I felt this like conviction, I guess you could call it, this burden of going like, I'm not an expert in this space. And I don't want to give people what I think is good biblical advice, but isn't actually helpful to them. And so I called my friend Hannah Hall. She's a licensed professional Christian counselor in Athens, Georgia. And I said, hey, I feel like adversity and anxiety are closely related. And she was like, 100% they are. It's the hard things in our life that often causes anxiety for us. And sometimes it lasts even longer than the situation we're actually in. And I said, would you be willing to help me create some resources to help people who feel like they're battling anxiety? And she was like, absolutely. And so we jumped in together. We created really two things. One were 3 free resources that we wanted just to be helpful to people. And so one talks about the exercise related to the chapter that I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, with what's in my control and an exercise that we can do there. The other exercise that we're kind of giving away for free is a stress inventory. And so to acknowledge some different places in your life where you might be feeling stress, where you're kind of avoiding things and where you may need to address it. And so there's a stress inventory there. But the resource that I'm most excited about is Hannah's done some work to help us identify some of the common factors of clinical anxiety to help people realize the difference between, hey, maybe I'm just having some anxious feelings and there's some like practices, exercises, things that I can do on my own, or maybe there's some like clinical anxiety here and I need to see a professional and kind of go to the next level. And so there's a little worksheet that she's put together with some accountability to help us figure out the way to do that. So that's the free stuff that we put together. And then we wanted to go a step further. And so we put together this course. It's 15 videos. It's way more in depth. There's exercises for each of the modules. just to kind of help people walk through, hey, here's some practical ways to battle anxiety. Here's some practical things you can do to navigate seasons of adversity as well.
That's great. I mean, it definitely makes sense how they, go together, and you two kind of combining on that is a great idea. The book and the course are available in a couple of weeks, right?
Yeah.
And how do they get that?
Yeah, so the book, if you're listening to this, they're available now.
That's true. We're recording early.
That's right. Yeah, so they came out June 15th. And if you go to thelemonbook.com, you'll find the free resources there. You'll find a link to purchase the book. You'll find a link to purchase the course as well. And if you're a student pastor listening, there'll be a link on the site as well to, if you wanted to do the course with your students, where you could buy it in bulk for a very, 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 very discounted rate. I'm talking like 80% off the course of the price of the course. We really believe in the content, and we want it to be helpful to students. And we're hoping that will help raise a more resilient generation as a result of all of this. And so, it'll all be available there, thelemonbook.com.
That's awesome. And so you're saying, and I kind of figured this, but you feel like even the course is a good fit for teenagers.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Teenagers too. Yeah,
100%. Yeah.
And we know that over the last number of years, certain things maybe have declined in terms of behaviors with teenagers, but things that have increased are anxiety and depression, and unfortunately suicide. So that's a great resource that you have here to help with that. And that's a good word, to raise a resilient generation. I think that's a great thing. Well, we'll definitely check out the book and the course when that comes out. I do want to ask you more about what you said in the beginning with your new role leading young adults, and you're kind of creating this thing, and it's early. Like, have you even had a gathering yet?
No, the first one's in August, so we got a couple of months.
Yeah, especially with I'm not sure exactly where Georgia is in the phases and the stages, and if churches are gathering in person yet or not. The ones I know of aren't in Georgia. But so you're going to do August. Give us, I know you don't even know yet because it's still brand new, but like, what are you dreaming about? What are you learning? What are you thinking about trying to engage? Because that is the generation, if you think 18 to 30, that is so absent in churches. Our church is only 15 years old. We're a plant. And, in the beginning, that was like that. And in many ways, a lot of the people were that age, that like was a dominant portion of our church when we got started. But, we're all older now. We're 15 years older, and that average age has moved. And so if you come from like a traditional church or something, you would come in our church and say, wow, there's so many young people. But if you're like you or me, and you're actually watching this stuff, you're thinking, oh, there's not enough. We're not doing a good enough job reaching that age group. So just tell us a little bit about what you're thinking or dreaming about.
Yeah. So I think this age group, this 18 to 30 age group, desires an authentic worship experience far more than they desire excellence. And I think the generation that we're living in right now has put authenticity on the altar and sacrificed it for excellence. And I think there's a generation coming going, we don't care how excellent it is. We just want it to be authentic. We want to feel like the people who are leading us really believe what they're saying. We don't care if you have perfect words to say it. We don't care if the worship experience isn't like the most perfect thing in the world. We just want to know that everyone's really in on this. And so we decided to call the gathering church. And the idea is really that the church was never a building. The church is the gathering. It's the collection of people who are pursuing Jesus, and we can be that wherever we are. And so most of the gatherings will take place at Mountain Lake Church, but there will be a good bit of them that happen in different varying locations all over Atlanta. And the thought behind that is really we want the church to gather together, and we want to create some authentic experiences where people can worship together. And then God willing, if this thing grows and it goes well, we'll add some small group components to it and some community components to it, because we know that's also something that this generation craves. But the hope is to start with an authentic worship experience that'll be a little bit longer than the traditional Sunday morning service at most churches, and we'll have a little bit more freedom and flowing and just authenticity in the service. The goal is not excellence. The goal is to be authentic. So.
When are you going to gather? Because I'm guessing it's not Sunday morning. Is it a Sunday night? Like when are you thinking about, or will it change?
So the gathering will be one Thursday night a month. And it'll kind of be dependent where there's a college that's pretty close by to us, the University of North Georgia. And so we'll pull students from there. There's also another college, Brenau University, that's pretty close. And so we'll look at their school schedule, and we'll try to, if we can, stick to like maybe the second Thursday of the month, or the first Thursday of the month. But at the end of the day, we just want to gather once a month on a Thursday night, and it may or may not be consistent with weeks. So,
but it's part of Mountain Lake. So I mean, this is a ministry here of Mountain Lake. And Mountain Lake has been around a while and gone through a number of changes. But have you felt like, and I know you just recently made the move there, that this was a void too there? Because I know a lot of great things have been happening in Mountain Lake. Talking to Frank Beeler and some other folks that attend there. But have you felt the sense, and maybe they even felt that that's why you all talked in the first place, that like, yeah, we've got this, we're reaching some of these folks, but we need more. We need to do something different.
Yeah, I think most churches in our area, and I would venture to say this is a national issue, but I'd say in our area for sure, I think most churches would say this is an issue, that the 18 to 30 demographic is not attending church regularly unless they have kids. Yeah, I think this is something that everyone's wrestling through. So it's definitely a gap that we identified in our community, and we wanted to try to be a part of the solution to create a space where people felt like they could call home. So
I know for me, our church tries to be a church that is for people who are not a part of any church, and we're very intentional about our language. In fact, I would say like that authenticity, excellence, tension. Yep. We probably do lean more towards the excellence, and some of that is just with the goal of like making sense if you're brand new to church. But both are true. Like what you want is the best of both worlds, right? Like nothing, one isn't too far an extreme. It feels authentic. It doesn't feel fake. It's good enough that it's not embarrassing. You know what I mean? Like there's some kind of management of that tension. And what I'd be curious to see, maybe after you gather, for a year or something, you'll get a sense for this. I feel like other churches around the country and probably around the world are already doing that church wide. I think of more of like the charismatic type of churches, such as Hillsong or the Belonging Company, where our friend Jim Wyman is, and things like that. Like those are the kind of churches that seem like they're doing what you're talking about, not just for young adults, but that's their whole church. Yeah. And if you're a Christian, well, sure, because authentic and you love it. And I guess the question I'll have is, and I think I already know the answer, but if you're 18 to 30 and you're brand new to faith, like you were, at one point, and you go to that, is that going to feel comfortable? Cause there's that thing too, there's just, I even think about it in the Bible where Paul talks about, gifts of the tongue and things like that. And to be used in a setting, you don't want it to be something that, scares people off, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Sure.
You also don't want it to be stripped down and completely, without authenticity and emotion. And so I feel like those churches, I think of the Belonging Company, I think of Hillsong, I think of some other ones too, Elevation to an extent. And again, I'm not just, when I say charismatic, I'm not just talking theologically, but that often, some of that is in there and it's strong, and they're reaching that age group. So clearly, I don't think it's just a redistribution of church people that are that age. I think they're also inviting their friends and reaching people. So anyway, that's just a ramble, but to me, that's a tension that has to be managed always in church. And I wonder what that'll be like, for 18 to 30, when you can go longer and do all that. I feel like you're saying things have changed and won't be a barrier anymore. What do you think?
Yeah, well, one, I'm not planning on speaking in tongues at the gathering. So
come on.
Just for clarity, that's not part of the plan for me.
Hey, you never know.
No, I definitely understand what you're saying. I think there's a way to be authentic without being weird and confusing. And I don't want to lean to the point of just assuming that everyone in the room knows everything about the Bible and we can just, go places that need no explanation. I wouldn't make that assumption at all, but I do think there's a way to be a little bit more unpolished, a little bit more raw and authentic, a little bit more vulnerable as a leader than maybe we've been in the past. And so my goal is to do that. It's not to be weird. It's not to be, overly charismatic, but it's more to be, hey, this is a place where we're all in process together and we're all figuring it out together, and no one here is perfect and nothing here is perfect. But we're all here because of the one who is perfect. And so we'll figure this out together and we'll go on the journey together, and we'll learn and we'll grow together in the process. And so, I think there's a way to do it without it being weird. I think there are some churches who have modeled how to do this well. and we'll learn from them and grow along the process as well. So,
well, I love it. I think it's great. I think too few churches are doing anything separate, to try to reach that age group, and just years go by and it just keeps growing. And, at what point you're just going to turn around and look and be like, oh, now it's 18 to 45. You know what I mean?
Right.
That has now been in that age group that is more absent, from church. So that's cool. Well, maybe we'll have to have you come back, next year or something like that and get an update. I think that'd be great.
Yeah. And if you're in Atlanta, come to church, come hang out.
That's on Thursday. Got to check you out on Thursday, or come to Mountain Lake on the weekend, but also on Thursday night. I think I'm going to enjoy coming back and hearing about that for sure. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you, in the midst of, the season that we're in, you're leading in this young adult realm now, but you led high school ministry, really, really strong high school ministry for a long time. We're, over 3 months or around 3 months into this, coronavirus, COVID, the churches aren't gathering. Some of them are looking to gather again. Some have started. What would you say to student pastors? Like, what do they need to be doing now? I mean, summer's coming up. They've already adapted and pivoted and got things online and changed some things. But like, what do you think they need to focus on now?
Yeah, I think we're in a unique season where we can be more personal than maybe we've ever been. And so I would say, I've been having this conversation with some student pastors. The natural tendency right now, I think, is to try to figure out what's going to be the big thing we do when everyone gets back, right? Like, what's the gathering going to look like? What's the large group going to look like? What's like the big thing, that everyone's going to talk about? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a big thing, right? Like, if you are in a context where you can do that, like, go for it. That's amazing. I'm all about doing big, extravagant things for the glory of God. So I have no issue with that at all. But I do think that should be secondary to community. And I think one of the things that we're learning in this coronavirus season is that the need for community has increased. I've actually, I did a poll with just some of my friends and family on social media and ended up with about 400 to 500 people who responded to the poll. And over 70% of them said that this season has caused an increased need for community in their life. And so I think all of us are realizing we need people. Even the most introverted people need people. And so I'd say, as a student pastor, to call personally as many students as you possibly can, just to check in with them, see how they're doing. They're not going to be used to picking up the phone and talking to someone, which I think is a good thing to do. To have our small group leaders doing that, to be thinking about how can we increase community and make it so that more students are known when we get back. I think that's going to be the game changer for student ministry. And it already has been, right? Like, that's been the secret sauce from the very beginning, but I think we have an opportunity to lean into it in a really unique way.
That's awesome. That's a good word. And I feel like what you're saying is very consistent with what a lot of the leaders that I respect are saying. You know what I mean? So that's a good thing. And now, it's 3 months in, there's probably more time for some of that because you've already made the adjustments and changes to kind of move online. And so there's probably some more time to dig in relationally. That's a good thing. Sure. Well, thelemonbook.com, right, is the website.
Thelemonbook.com, that's the one.
How else can people connect with you?
Gerald Fadayomi on all social media platforms.
All right. Well, Gerald, thanks for coming back on the podcast. Congrats on the book. I hope it does really well, and the course too. I mean, that is a really, really practical, helpful resource, both of those things. So, and like you said, if it can help build a resilient generation, that would be amazing.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me.
You bet. Well, that was a fun conversation with Gerald, and I love that he wrote a book about facing adversity and faith, and man, the things that he's been through. You heard that there in our interview. We need more influence like that, of the kind of faith that can hold strong through adversity and through trials and all those kinds of things, and practical tools like he talks about in the book for how to get through that, I think is just a great thing. And here are the action items I thought of coming out of that interview. The first one's obvious. Get the book, read it, apply it to your life, learn how to depend on God more. With some practical ways that we can turn towards God in the midst of adversity. And then our conversation there at the end, we talked about reaching that 18 to 30 crowd. Could you try one thing? Maybe not right now, because you're probably gearing up to gather for in-person services again, or it's down the road somewhere you see it, or maybe you already have. But can you make a note, and can we make a note to try something to reach that 18 to 30 age group? And then I mentioned this in the beginning, and we didn't, again, this conversation wasn't about that, but I would watch Gerald's content about racism and injustice and the conversations going on in our country in the last few weeks. Just go to his Instagram, Gerald Fadayomi, and you can see so many great things there that he's been saying that I've been learning from that are just really, really good. So again, you can get all the links and notes at nickblevins.com/episode 195. Thanks for listening. Next week, we're going to have Scott Magdalene on the podcast. I've talked about Serve HQ and the Huddle Up tool, and we use Trained Up and the tools they create that I just think are great for churches. So we're going to deep dive that a little bit, and you can get kind of an in-depth look at what is that, how can it work in your ministry. Communication is obviously so important. And so we're going to talk with Scott next week. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.